Hello everybody, my name is Noah, and today we are going to be doing a buying guide on the Atari 2600. So this video is mostly pointed towards people that want to get to know more about the Atari 2600 and want to learn more about the hardware and just what to look for in games and systems and controllers. And today we're going to go into each and every one. So the Atari 2600 got released in 1977. It didn't really kick off and get big until the early 80s though, but it was a great success and practically everybody in the 80s had this in their living room, just chilling under the TV. Which I think, honestly, my opinions on the system real quick, I really do enjoy the system. It always has I never grew up with it. I got one about, I would say, I think it's about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half. And I've always loved it. It's fun just to play some certain games. You get to use your imagination with it. And it's just overall a really good system. Now, the hardware. With the Atari 2600, you got these 6 switches up front. Now there's the 6-switch model, the 4-switch model, and this is the 6th switch, as you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the 4-switch model is pretty much the same thing, but you have the on, the color, and then this switch is moved to the back, and there's just a little flip switch, and this switch is also moved to the back, and then you have these two that are still here. They're pretty much the same on rarity wise. I usually see more of a 6 switch than a 4 switch, but there's not that much difference to it. I would say I'd rather this because it's easier to access the difficulty one, so I would rather say pick up a 6 switch. Now there's the 4 switch, the 6 switch, and then there's the heavy 6er. Now the heavy 6er it's really hard to kind of notice sometimes. There's the front of this. Now the heavy 6, this is not a heavy 6er. The heavy 6er, and it's called the heavy 6er because it's a little bit more heavier of a console. And it has a little more curved up here. It has just a little more curve, and there's a plate in here that protects the motherboard, and it makes it heavier. So if you ever see one of those, make sure to pick them up because they're definitely a little bit harder to come by. Now, the next console we got is the Vader console. And why it's called the Vader, you ask, is this black finish up here. Now, the normal Atari's got the wood grain finish, which I do really like the wood grain, but you gotta admit, just this solid black shine up here and right up here, just solid black. Now this is what a 4 switch looks like, and it's like what I was saying. It's the power, the TV type, and then you got the game select and the game reset. It's the same old thing, and you got the 2 switches back here to do the same thing. Now I would honestly, if you see this out for cheap, these are actually really hard to come by. I never really see these for cheap. I see them for sale, but I never really find these at a good price. So if you ever see a Vader out there, make sure to pick it up. And also, another thing that was released was a more compact version of the Atari, because the Atari is a pretty big console. Like, it's a pretty big when compared to other things. Like, I don't have anything to compare it to, but it is very big. And they made a more compact version, and at a lower cost, they made the Atari 2600 Junior. Now, this is a clone console. This is not exactly what it looks like, but it just says Atari 2600 Junior right here. It is almost exactly identical as this one. Now, you just have the same thing, power, but you have these weird switches that do it. You got left difficulty, right difficulty. You got select, which is like the game select. You have reset, and then yeah, pretty much everything. You got the power, the 2 control ports, all the same stuff. Now this is a lot lighter, and the Atari 2600 Juniors, they're not bad. This is definitely, it's still long, but it is definitely, when compared to this, a lot smaller. But honestly, I mean, I have room to store the consoles, so I would rather pick up an original Atari 2600 compared to a Junior. But the Juniors totally do work fine, and I've really never run a problem with these ones. Now I have 2 clone consoles here that I found for really cheap, I think at a garage sale. And they have preloaded games on them. I just wanted to show you these guys. They're kind of cool. They say TV game on there. They can play Atari 2600 cartridges, but they usually glitch out and they're not as high quality as the original. Now, another console that was released, and this is kind of weird, honestly. I didn't kind of believe it at first. It was kind of just like, what? Why did this happen? And how could this happen? Now, there's a Sears Telegames version of an Atari 2600. And Sears, the company Sears, as we all know pretty much, it's kind of going out of business around where I live, but it's still Sears, and they made their own versions of games and consoles. Now, I don't have one particularly, but here's a picture of one. It is practically the same thing. There's a different wood grain on the finish, and the switches are, I think they have 3 switches. I don't think there's a 4th switch, Sears. I might be wrong, though. But yeah, it's just a different, pretty much just a different look. It is the same exact hardware, though. And yeah, that's all the different variations of the Atari 2600 consoles. Now, one very important thing about the Atari 2600. Now, my flat screen TV can do this, but most of the newer ones, you really cannot have that connection to what I'm about to talk about. Now, the Atari 2600 is so old that it has RF connection. Now, RF connection looks like this. It's just this little connector. And this does not have any input to a flat screen TV, but mine actually luckily does, which is kind of weird. You don't see that too often. So you cannot plug this directly into your TV. You need either a switch box or this male to female connector, coax connector. Now the switch box, they are not as high quality. They seem to glitch out, and they're really not that good. I would definitely not recommend getting a switch box unless it comes with the console. Now, if you do have an Atari 2600 and you got a switch box, I mean, it does work, but you would really want to get this. Now, this, as what I said, is a male to female coax adapter, and you plug it in to the end of this, and then screw it into the port on the back of most likely a box TV. Now, these go for around $5 on eBay, and they're pretty much, you get the highest quality. And I would just honestly, if you get an Atari and you just have that, don't get a switch box. Because honestly, switch boxes are even a little more expensive, which is kind of weird because they're worse quality. But yes, always get this. Now, they have different variations. Some are gold, some are a little bit longer. Some say they have higher definition, and they're like $20. Now, they either are lying or they actually do have a point. You're really not going to have to struggle that much. I would just say get this. Now, with that, with the TV, this can only screw into certain TVs. So I would recommend getting an old box TV. You can find them at thrift stores, flea markets, anything really. And they're usually dirt cheap. And you don't have to go getting a big old box TV. You can just get a mini one like I have, and I'll show you a picture right up here. And it works great, and the games look great because these are made to work on those kind of TVs, so they're going to look the best as they can. Now, if you put it on a flat screen, it's not going to look as good. It's going to look all kind of washed out and way too big. And yes, so I would highly recommend investing, if you're serious into Atari, investing into a box TV for when you play the games. Also, another thing is when you screw this in, you have to be on channel 3 or channel 4. Now, I always use channel 3, and remember what I said about the bottom with the channel select? You're going to have to correspond with channel 3 and the 3 on here, switch it. Now, when you plug it in, if you forget about this, it's not going to work, and you're going to be like, what the crap, what's going on? You have to correspond this with the channel on your TV. When I got home and got my Atari for the first time, I didn't know that, and I plugged it in, and I was like, what the heck, what the crap, why is it not working? So that's one good thing you need to know. Alright, next up, now we have Atari 2600 controllers. We have a lot to go through, so I'm going to kind of go through them quick and try to talk about them. But the original ones is the Atari 2600 controller. This came with the Atari 2600. And overall, I really do not like this controller. The reason is the stick, when you move it, is very, very stiff. And I do not like that. It still is a great controller and it is very iconic. Even if you don't know what an Atari 2600 is, if you look at this, most people would honestly be able to recognize this controller. Now you have just an action button and a control stick. It doesn't get any more simple than that. Now, with all the other controllers that work with the system, they have this port, which looks like that. And any control port that has that will work with the system. Just putting that out there. If you know any controllers that have that kind of port, they work with an Atari 2600. Another licensed controller Atari released was the paddle controller. Now, the paddle controller is called it because you usually have games that work with this, are mostly like Brickout, Circus Atari, Warlords, some really great games that work with this. So I would strongly, if you get an Atari 2600 and you only have this controller, these don't go for too much. They're around like $10 or even less online. So I would highly recommend getting these. The way you can tell is on the front of a cartridge, it usually says what controller to use it with. Now this is combat, and I keep referring it to. It says use with joystick controller. Now joystick controller is referring to the original controller. Paddle controller games, it says on the bottom use a paddle controller, which is good to know because sometimes looking at the front of the game, it actually tells you some good information you need to know. So sometimes don't just pop that game in and like, what the crap, what's going on? Why is this controller not working or something? It's good to look at this. And this one, for example, says 1 to 2 players using joystick controllers, 2 players cooperative or competitive, 9 play options. So that means we get all that information from that, which it tells you it's 1 to 2 player game. You can work together or work against, and it has 9 play options. So you can go through that game select and find 9 different games of this version. Now some do not have that nice option, like Parker Brothers ones have no the label that tells you like what controllers to use, but most Parker Brother games only just use the joystick controller, just to let you know. Now that's another thing with the Atari 2600. It's branching off from controllers real quick. There is many different shells and differentiations from the companies that make them. Now you have the standard Atari normal shell that's just rounded and it looks like this. And all games look like that and have that font and everything. But for like companies like Activision have their own different shell, and what I mean by that is they have these grooves right here. It says Activision right there. It's kind of hard to pick up, but it says their name and it's different like everything. The board's different. Like it's crazy how different gaming companies make different like casings for their games. So it's cool because like imagine like a new game like that, like an Xbox 360 game, like coming in a totally different sized shape and like looking totally different, not having that green case, and you're just like, what the crap? That's weird. So yeah, just one thing I thought I should point out. Now there is also a trackball controller for the Atari 2600, and I'll show you up there. It's really great for games like Centipede and Millipede. Now, if you ever been to an arcade and played those kind of games, they have this little ball, and there's like other games like bowling games at the arcade that use it, and you just roll it. And I do not have one of those controllers. They are pretty pricey, and I haven't found one on like. I don't usually like buying controllers online just because I like buying it at a store. I mean, you can return things online, but then it gets all messy. And I just have local game stores, and I just check them all the time. Another controller that was the Atari keyboard controller. Now, it looks like this, and if you ever seen any other game controller that had buttons on the bottom, it's pretty much like that. It's pretty clicky, and it's used for games that are like I think there's Codebreaker on the Atari 2600 that uses this. It's for more like advanced games that require a lot of buttons. And it's pretty cool. I like the controller for games like that because I'm interested in decoding, and it's a fun controller to use, I guess. But it's not used for many controllers, so if you do not like those kind of games, you really don't need this controller in your collection. Another controller, which is kind of under the same concept of the last keyboard controller, is the Atari Video Touchpad. Now, it was mostly used for the game right there, Star Raiders, and I think it was used for a few other games. Now, once again, if you don't like those games, you don't really need this controller, but it is pretty cool. I'm not going to take it out of the box because that's what it looks like. You got paper overlays to tell you what the buttons and what each button does for each individual games. Kind of like the, what's the name of it? The ColecoVision. It does that. And it's pretty cool controller overall. It's pretty much like the keyboard controller. I don't know why they made two different ones, and this is still, once again, licensed by Atari. Now, the last licensed controller that was made by Atari, now I'm actually not for sure if this is technically licensed by Atari. I'm pretty sure it is. It is called the Kids controller, and it is, once again, pretty much a keypad controller, and like the Video Touchpad and the Kids controller, pretty much all the same thing. Now, I'm going to show you a picture right up here. And it is a pretty cool, I mean, like, it's used for, like, Cookie Monster's Alphabet or something. Like, it's really for kids' educational games on the Atari 2600. And it is a cool controller, but once again, it does have mushier buttons, I guess, for the kids. I don't know. But that is all the licensed controllers for the Atari 2600. Now we're going to get into the unlicensed and like third-party controllers. Now, there is a bunch of controllers that will work for the Atari 2600. They all just, once again, have to have that port, which it is 1, 2, 3, 5 on the bottom and 4 on the bottom. Now, there is computer ones that you can find that have close to that, but it's like 7 and it's like 6. So it throws you off because it's got to have 5 on the top and 4 on the bottom connection. One controller that I did clean on my YouTube channel, and it is honestly, I think, probably my favorite controller to use for joystick games on the Atari, is the Gem Stick. Now, the reason I like this controller so much is the stick is still pretty stiff, but it has that nice feel to it. The rubber feels good on your hands when you're playing, and this button, now you might be thinking, what, it's just a button, but it has that extra clickiness to it. And it's kind of hard to explain unless I just, like, if you kind of were here in front of me and I showed you. But it's just got that clickiness to it. So, like, when you're playing games, you kind of just mash it. And it feels good when you're, like, I don't know. It's hard to explain. But if you do want a controller for the Atari 2600, I would say this is my most recommended one. These don't really go for that much compared to the original Atari 2600 controller. They're around $10. Now, most of these third-party controllers, most are going to go as $15, and pretty much anything with Atari is going to be very cheap, unless you got a rare game, or the trackball controller is really the only expensive ones. Next one we got that I do really like, and I would say is one I use a lot too, is the Wiko stick, which actually, yeah, made by Wiko, and it is a really nice controller. Now, if you don't like that stiffness on the Atari 2600 controller, this is the controller for you. It is very movable. It's kind of hard to show, but it does feel really good. You got these grips right here for your fingers to go in. You got this action button on the top that feels nice and got a nice click to it. Now, the thing is with this that I do not like is that you can turn this, and there's this arrow right here on the top, and this is up always. The arrow is up. So if you accidentally turn it and you hold it another direction, you're thinking that is up, but that's actually going to the left. So it kind of messes with you a little bit that way. But besides that, it is a great controller. It's great for Snoopy and the Red Baron and any like flying or shooter games. Just like you need like fast reaction and you want to it makes you feel like you're going that direction a lot better, and it feels really good. I would highly recommend this one. This one is the like more pricier one. It goes around 15 plus. But if you're serious about Atari and you really want a comfy controller, I would recommend this one. Now, next up, we have... Now we're going to fly through these ones because those ones I recommend and these ones I just kind of have because they're just kind of here. There's the Slick Stick. It's not really that great. It's got a button that... It does have a nice spring to it. It's not really that great. It's kind of cheap, and I don't know. If you want it, you kind of get it. I'm kind of crazy with Atari 2600 controllers. I have so many. This one is the Quick Shot. Now, the nice thing about this is it's got suction cups when you're putting it on the table. It's nice for flight games. It's got 2 different buttons, so if you want to press the button on the top or button right here, it's different. This one, right around the same price point. It's not bad. Controller that does work with the Atari from the Atari 7800. Now, this is a licensed controller, and I know I'm talking about unlicensed, but a controller that does work with the Atari 2600 and the Atari 7800 is the Atari 7800 controller, and I absolutely love this controller. It's really nice. The stick up here actually feels pretty good. It kind of feels... I don't know, it feels really good. You got both buttons on each side. They're the same exact action. If you're left-handed, you press the left button or the right button. And it feels nice. Now, you might be thinking like you want it to be on the top, but no, actually holding this like this and then moving it with the other hand is really, really nice. I strongly recommend this controller. Now, this one is a pricier one too because it is licensed. And it goes around, I'm guessing around 15. I don't know exactly. But that's also a good controller you can use. There's another, this is like an older version of the Quick Shot. It's just, you got a trigger, which is kind of cool. You don't see that too many of them that actually have a trigger. It's trigger, button up front, has the same action. Feels pretty good. It's not a bad controller. This one is the Point Master. And this one actually is pretty nice when you're talking about like the Wicco stick. This one is comfy like this one. The movability is once again pretty good. I would recommend the Wicco stick a little bit more. They got the button up top, and it's a little bit more stiff, but it still is nice. And yeah, I like the design of the artwork, and it is a cool controller made by Disc Washer. I'm not even joking, that's the name. And that is it. Another thing I do want to throw out there real quick is the Atari Flashback. Now, Atari made this Flashback console that's got built-in games, and it does have the same connection port as the original Atari 2600. And it looks like this. And the stick is very movable. Now, that's my only complaint about the original one. When you compare it to the original one, it is kind of crazy. The stiffness, I'm pushing like all the way hardness with that. That's how much it moves, and it's really not that much. But with this Flashback controller, you got full movability, and it feels really nice. The button has that nice clicky sound, and it's great. And you guys might be thinking, why does a clicky sound like work good when you just got one button and it's got a nice... I just like the clickiness of controllers. It's kind of weird. But that is all the controllers for the Atari 2600. Now it's time to get in some games. Also, one quick thing I forgot to talk about. If you do not have any Atari 2600 controllers and you have a Sega Genesis controller, it can also work. It has the same exact connection port as the Atari 2600, and you can use the D-pad on there, and I think it's the B button that is the action button, and it does work all right. I would recommend getting a controller, an official Atari 2600 controller, or the Wicco stick, or the Gem stick. But if you do just need one for like another player to play 2-player with, it's a fun, cool controller. Now we're going to hop into the games. Now I'm going to go through these kind of quick just for the sake of time, but they are really good games. The one game I showed on my Atari 2600 Wicco stick cleaning video was at the end to test out the controller. I used Pitfall 2. Now this game is really cool. If you've ever played the original Pitfall, it does everything the original Pitfall does and even better. It's a great game. If you do want to see me play that through a little bit, go back to that video, check it out at the end. It is a really fun game. This game does go pretty expensive. It goes for around 20 bucks, which not many Atari 2600 games go for that much money. But this game, I highly recommend it. It is great. It's made by Activision, and you're going to see a lot of great games are made by Activision. They're one of the strongest, best second-party developers for the Atari 2600. And any Activision game, and I'm gonna stick to this, pretty much any Activision game on the Atari 2600 is a great game. Like, I'm being serious. I want to eventually get all the Activision games for the system. There's great games like the original Pitfall, Crackpots, which is this game where you drop pots onto spiders, and which sounds kind of weird, but it's fun. Just look up Activision, and they're great. And they still do make games today. That they're okay company today, but back then, the Atari 2600 days, they were fighting strong. Another game I like to talk about is two arcade games. It's Frogger and Cubert, and Parker Brothers made these. It's kind of hard to see, but they are pretty good games. With Cubert, it's pretty much exactly like the arcade port, and it does look a little bit worse, but you are playing on an Atari 2600 console. You're not playing on a big arcade cab. Now, Frogger, same way. It is really fun. There is also Frogger 2. Which is really cool, and is actually a really rare game. Not really rare, but it is harder to find. If you see that game, snatch it up. I can't even find one for a good price. Now, there is a bunch of Pac-Mans on, not a bunch, but there's Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. I do not recommend this, not at all. It was cause of the video game crash of the 80s, and it killed the video game industry. This game and another game that I don't even want in my collection, and I'm showing you a picture up here, and it is horrible. Look up videos of this game. It is horrible. Any Steven Spielberg video game is pretty much trash, even on the NES, and they do them wrong. But yes, do not get this game. Do not get the ET game unless you get it for free, which I got this one for free. That's the reason I got it. Now, another great, but there is this one, the reason this Pac-Man is bad, you might be asking, is Pac-Man goes like this. He goes up and he goes like this. There's a lot of flickering on the screen. It looks like a big fat turd. But Mrs. Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 is a very good improvement on that. She turns, there's not too much flickering, there's a little bit of flickering, but it is a great game. It looks a lot more like the original arcade, and it holds a lot more respect to that game. Now, my personal favorite on the Atari 2600 of Pac-Man is Junior Pac-Man. Now, you might be thinking you never heard of this before. I haven't either. I only think this came out in one arcade cab. I've never really seen it anywhere else. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's Junior Pac-Man, and it is a really fun game. You are this little dude with a little Pac-Man with a hat, and the maps are a lot bigger, and the difficulty is definitely more up there. So if you like a little more difficulty with your game, it is great. They still hold competitions to these games and this game, and it is really fun. Now, don't get Pac-Man, get Mrs. Pac-Man and Junior Pac-Man. Another great game that you're going to find everywhere, under your bed, when you go... The reason I say that is because this game is so easy to find. Do not spend over $1 on this game. I'm being serious. It is Combat. If you ever watch Angry Video Game Nerd, he has a million copies in the background of this video just to be funny. And Combat, it is a great game. I'm not going to lie. It has great multiplayer. There's tanks, there's airplanes. It's really fun, just multiplayer game, and I would highly recommend this if you're getting into the Atari 2600. Another great game is Taz. We're gonna go a little quicker. Taz, you are in this big tornado, and you gotta get the hamburgers and like French fries and stuff, but you don't want to hit the bombs. And there's lines, and I'll show a picture up there. It is a really fun game. Highly recommend picking it up. Now this is a tongue twister to say, Worm World 1. And it is a really fun game, as you can kind of see on the picture. I'm not going to show footage of this one because the picture's right here. You got that shooter, and then you got these worms that go across the screen. And it is a really fun shooter if you like Galaga or any other arcade shooters. This throws a cool twist into there and is very colorful and is a really fun game to play. Another cool game that I like in the arcade and on the 2600 port is pretty good. Gyrus on the 2600 is made by, once again, Parker Bros. The Parker Brothers games are pretty good. There's a few games, but mostly Parker Brothers games are kind of like Activision, but Activision's a lot better. If you see a Parker Brothers game, it's most likely going to be good. This game, it has, if you don't know what Gyrus is, it's this circle kind of angle, and you take your ship and you move it around and you shoot down into the enemies that are further down the screen. In the arcade, it looks amazing. It's probably one of my favorite arcade games of all time. It has to be at least in my top 10. I would highly recommend checking this one out. Now you got these games, which are made by Mattel, and we got 2 Tron games on the Atari 2600. You got Adventures of Tron, and Tron's Deadly Disc. Now they are fun games. I'm pretty sure Tron's Deadly Disc is where you throw it and you hit people, and like it's kind of hard to explain. Look up a video on it. It's really fun games. They are a little more pricey, not super expensive though. I think they're like $10, but they are great. You got Frogs and Flies, which is a great multiplayer game where you're on frogs. 2 frogs on each lily pad, and they jump up and they grab, they stick out their tongue and they grab flies, and they just like it's really fun. You like try to jump up and grab your color fly because you don't want to eat the other one or you lose points. It's a really fun multiplayer game just to lose some time on. You got Burger Time on the Atari 2600. It is exactly like the arcade, but the graphics are a little bit worse. But that's what to expect with an Atari 2600 games. Now another game that is it's not necessarily great, but it is still kind of cool. It is Donkey Kong. Now you might be thinking, what the crap? This is a Nintendo game on an Atari console. And yes, it is a Nintendo game on an Atari console. Nintendo, if you didn't know, I'm just going to go by it real quick. They did not want to really be hardware. They made cards, and I want to talk about Nintendo history a lot more. That'd be a cool video. I did talk about Nintendo handhelds. If you want to watch that video, it is on my channel. But this is Donkey Kong on the Atari. It kind of does suck, I'm not going to lie. But it is still pretty fun. If you played Donkey Kong before, the first 3 levels are only what's on here. Now after you get to level 3, it loops back to the first one. It's okay, honestly. I just like to throw it out there because most people don't know that it exists. But yes, Donkey Kong on the Atari 2600, a pretty cool game. Now that is the games I recommend for the Atari 2600. Overall, I love the Atari 2600. It is a really cool system. But you do have to use your imagination with the graphics. It's kind of hard to explain, but I honestly do really like the Atari 2600. If you have either a grandpa or a dad that ever had it, like my dad had Atari 2600, and playing these games with them brought back memories for him, so it was fun to play those with him. So yeah, that's the hardware and what to look for with the Atari 2600. If you have any questions, feel free to leave questions down in the comments below. And another thing is, I just wanted to show you, it kind of doesn't revolve around anything, but if you do like Atari, there's one thing Atari released in their catalog was the Atari Game Center. It's this huge thing where you can take your console, trying to show you, and sit it on top here, and underneath you can store games. It's pretty cool for people that just want to have a few games. It holds just that limited amount of games in there. I have a lot more Atari games because they are very cheap and easy to come by. Most people that have Atari games at garage sales or flea markets, they know they're not worth that much, which they really aren't. they just kind of just either like nobody really wants them or you get them really cheap. Like most of my Atari 2600 games I've paid $1 or $2 for, but there's those special games like Pitfall 2 that do cost a little bit more, and you can't really find for $1 unless you're freaking really lucky. Well, that is my opinions on the Atari 2600. I hope everybody has a fantastic day, and remember, smile on.